A famous name, a poisoned plate, and a family secret no one expected. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Join the conversation. Drop a comment with your city or country. Hearing from you all makes this so rewarding. Let's begin. You can count on one hand the things that can drag Nero Wolfe out of his orchid rooms before 4 o'clock, and you'd still have enough fingers left to scratch your head in disbelief. So when the phone rang that Thursday morning at 10:17, and Fritz scurried into the office looking like he'd spotted a mouse in the pantry, I knew it wasn't a call about the delivery of Volk's saucis minuet. I was already in my usual station, desk, feet up, coffee in hand, while Wolfe sat in his chair, a brown satin robe clinging to him like a reluctant accomplice. "Mr. Wolfe," Fritz said, breathless. It's Mr. James Corrigan. He's coming here." I raised an eyebrow. Wolfe didn't. He didn't even twitch a lip. James Corrigan wasn't a household name for most, but in Manhattan he was royalty of the sort that dined on old money and sipped vintage grievances. The Corrigan family built half the city's limestone monuments to capitalism, and James was the latest installment, young enough to have ideals, old enough to regret them. "Coming here?" I said. "Now?" "In 15 minutes, Fritz confirmed, wringing his hands like they were wet dish rags. Wolfe closed his eyes. "Why? Should I call him off?" I offered, not really expecting him to bite. He opened one eye. "No. The imposition is already committed." 15 minutes later, Corrigan arrived. His entrance disturbed the brownstone's sanctity in a way only someone raised to assume they were the main character of every room could manage. He wore a grey suit that probably cost more than Fritz's monthly grocery bill, but his eyes had the desperate gleam of a man whose credit was running out, emotionally, financially, maybe both. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, stepping onto the Persian, rug like it owed him a bow. "Thank you for seeing me. I won't waste your time." Wolfe, still parked behind his desk, grunted something that might have been, "I wish you would." Corrigan plunged ahead. "I need your help. It's about the Corrigan Foundation, my grandfather's legacy. Something happened yesterday that could ruin it. A lunch." Wolfe opened his eyes fully, which in his world was the equivalent of another man standing up and shouting. I put my coffee down. Lunch wasn't usually a motive for murder, but I'd seen lesser things spark bigger explosions. Corrigan dug into his breast pocket and pulled out an envelope. His hand shook slightly as he passed it to me. "You need to..." Read that, I did. It was a printed memo neat as a pin with a letterhead so thick it could probably stop a bullet. A lunch meeting yesterday, himself, a woman named Lily Rowan. Yeah, that Lily Rowan, my eyebrows did a jig. And one Everett Horn, trustee and chief financial advisor for the Corrigan Foundation. At the lunch, according to Corrigan's typed-up confession, Horn made some remarks suggesting that adjustments had been made to certain foundation investments, adjustments that could legally qualify as fraud if you had an especially grumpy judge. "I'm being blackmailed," Corrigan said flatly. "Someone recorded the conversation. They're threatening to go public unless I cooperate." "Cooperate how?" Wolfe asked, sounding like he was asking for the brand of vinegar Fritz used to pickle. Beats Corrigan's mouth tightened. "By withdrawing from the Foundation's management, publicly resigning, quietly walking away. And you presume," Wolfe said, "that your departure would hand control to whomever orchestrated this little melodrama." Corrigan nodded, jaw set. Wolfe closed his eyes again. "I dislike melodrama." I knew the drill. I also knew Wolfe wouldn't be taking any case that would require him to so much as leave the brownstone, so I leaned back, waiting for the polite dismissal. It didn't come. Instead, Wolfe said, "You will stay and explain, Mr. Corrigan. You will begin at the beginning, omit nothing, and tolerate my interruptions." He gestured toward the red armchair that served as our unofficial witness box. Corrigan obeyed, sinking into it. I frowned. Wolfe was interested. That meant I was interested. It also meant trouble, and probably a lot of it. Corrigan wasn't 3 minutes into explaining how a legacy could topple over a Cobb salad when the doorbell chimed again. Fritz, who'd been hovering like a butler in a Gothic novel, scurried off to answer it. Wolfe grimaced, which for him was a full emotional outburst. I moved to intercept, but I was too late. Fritz was already ushering a woman into the office. Woman I knew too well. Lily Rowan, I said, standing. I should have baked a cake. Lily, all silk, steel, and sharp green eyes, shot me a smile that could have lit up Times Square if she hadn't been aiming it like a dart. Archie, always a pleasure. She floated in like she owned the place, which I guess she did in spirit, if not in deed, considering how often she'd yanked Wolfe and me into one melodrama or another over the years. Behind her came another figure, a small, thin man with prematurely grey hair and a clipboard tucked under one arm like a security blanket. Everett Horne, I figured. No introduction needed. His face was made of the same material as Wall Street, haggard, polished, and faintly predatory. Corrigan stood up fast, his voice sharp. I didn't ask you to come here. Lily perched herself on the arm of the red chair, unbothered. I asked myself, you weren't exactly subtle when you stormed out of the Cressida yesterday, and Everett here has a vested interest. Horne gave a little bow, half apology, half self-preservation. I only want to ensure the Foundation's reputation remains intact. Wolfe made a noise that sounded suspiciously like a suppressed yawn. Your reputations or the Foundation's? Horne blinked. They're one and the same. If they were, Wolfe said mildly, you would not be here. That shut Horne up. For about 5 seconds. I demand to know what is being planned here, Horne said, voice climbing. If any reckless action... Wolfe held up a hand. It wasn't loud, but it might as well have been a gunshot. Silence fell. This is my house, Wolfe said, not yours. I will hear Mr. Corrigan. I will decide what actions, if any, are appropriate. If you find that arrangement unpalatable, the door through which you entered remains available. That was the Wolfe special, frosty civility with the edge of a stiletto. Horne looked like he wanted to argue, but Lily gave him a side glance sharp enough to cut glass. He clamped his mouth shut and sat down across from Corrigan, perching on the very edge of the green chair like it might bite. Good, Wolfe said. Now, Mr. Corrigan, continue. Corrigan did, his voice tight. He explained that after lunch yesterday, he'd received an anonymous email. Attached was a voice recording, only a snippet, but enough to make his hair stand on end. In it, Horne could be heard saying something very cozy about reallocating charitable funds to more productive purposes. Corrigan objected rather strongly. Horne reassured him that no one would ever know, only now someone did. Someone who wanted Corrigan out of the picture. And if I leave the Foundation, Corrigan said, who takes over? Everett, temporarily, until the board appoints a new chair. Convenient, I said. Horne flushed. This is slander. Perhaps, Wolfe said. Perhaps not. The point is moot until I learn more. He looked at me. Archie, you will gather facts. Start with Mr. Horne's professional history. Then the Board of Trustees, and whoever was present yesterday. Yes, sir, I said. And bring me the full context of the lunch, before, during, and after. I nodded. Translation. Don't just ask about the blackmail. Find out who wanted Corrigan and Horne at odds in the first place. Fritz reappeared, hovering anxiously. There's another visitor, he whispered to me. I gritted my teeth. The brownstone was becoming Grand Central Station. Who is it? I asked. Fritz looked pained. A Miss Elena Garver. She says it concerns the same matter. Corrigan groaned under his breath. Lily brightened. Oh, good. This is getting lively. Wolfe closed his eyes again. If he squeezed them any tighter, he'd pop a vein. "Archie," he said wearily, "control this invasion." "On it," I said, and I went to let in yet another piece of the puzzle. "Excellent. You're being very methodical about this, just as Wolfe would want it, following your direction. Now, generate Section 3 of the story, ensuring smooth continuity from the previous section. Maintain the same pacing, character development, and mystery build-up without premature reveals. Keep the word count consistent, around 1,200 words, progressing the narrative naturally while leading into the next section. This section is titled, "If you ever want to see Nero Wolfe's blood pressure do a little jig, let 5 different people start talking in his office at once. And if you want to see it break into a full Charleston, let them all have different versions of the same story." I brought Elena Garver into the room like a hostess dragging in the next course of a very unwanted dinner party. She was slim, mid-30s, in a black shift dress and a little red jacket that screamed money without hollering about it. Her dark hair was pinned neatly back, and her expression was somewhere between anxious and calculated. My gut, which has been wrong fewer times than I can count without taking my shoes off, told me she was used to slipping through cracks and coming out polished on the other side. She walked past me without a glance and took a seat on the edge of the couch, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her nails were immaculate. Her eyes, though, were taking in the room the way a cat sizes up a rocking chair. "Miss Garver," Wolfe said, "you claim this matter concerns you. Elaborate." Of course, she gave a slight smile. Professional, pleasant, utterly opaque. "I'm the Foundation's Director of Outreach. It's my job to protect its reputation. And frankly," she cut a glance toward Corrigan and Horn, "the last 48 hours have been a disaster." Corrigan stiffened. Horn gave a dry little cough, a sound that could have meant anything from indigestion to murder. "Specifically," Wolfe prodded, "I received a tip yesterday," Garver said. "An anonymous message. It mentioned the lunch, implied financial improprieties, and hinted that the media would be very interested. It suggested I might want to distance myself from the current leadership before things got ugly." Wolfe grunted. "And your response?" "I deleted it," she said crisply. "I'm loyal to the Foundation, not necessarily to individuals who might compromise it." That little shot ricocheted around the room and nicked both Corrigan and Horn. Lily, perched on the arm of the chair like a bored duchess at a duel, smiled slightly. I leaned against the wall and filed away the fact that Miss Garver wasn't just worried about the Foundation. She was already choosing which lifeboat to jump into if it started sinking. Before Wolfe could nudge further, the phone rang again. Fritz poked his head in, looking like he wanted to resign from humanity. "It's Mr. Saul Panzer, sir," he said. "On the upstairs line. He says it's urgent." Wolfe grunted and waved me off. I took the stairs 2 at a time and picked up the line in the upstairs hall. "Yeah, Saul?" "I did a quick look," Saul said, voice low and precise. "Everett Horn's clean technically, but there's a thread. 2 years ago he recommended an investment, Sunterra Pharmaceuticals, to another non-profit. Looked good at the time. 6 months later the company tanked. Quiet SEC investigation, no charges. Any connection to yesterday's lunch? Maybe. Guess who bought out Sunterra after it collapsed? Don't tell me, Corrigan Foundation. Bingo. Through a shell company 3 layers deep. I whistled under my breath. "Thanks, Saul. Stay close." I hung up and headed back downstairs. Wolfe didn't glance up as I re-entered, but his nostrils flared slightly. That was his way of asking, well, I gave a tiny nod. We'd trade info later. For now, the fish were still swimming around the room, and Wolfe wasn't ready to pull the net. Instead, he sat forward a fraction of an inch, an event notable enough to deserve a calendar entry, and said, "Miss Rowan." Lily, queen of unflappability, arched an eyebrow. "You attended this lunch," Wolfe said. "What was your role?" Lily gave a little shrug, all elegance and deflection. I was there as a friend of James's, and maybe as a pressure valve. He thought Everett and I might keep the conversation civilized. Corrigan made a noise under his breath. Horne stared daggers at her. "You were a mediator?" Wolfe asked. "I was a witness," Lily corrected sweetly, "and what I witnessed was two men, trying very hard to smile while they slid knives into each other." "Details," Wolfe said. His tone suggested she'd better provide them while her head was still attached. Lily obliged, flipping through her memory like a Rolodex. Horne suggested moving some of the Foundation's liquid assets into a venture capital fund he had personal stakes in. James balked, loudly. Horne reminded him that diversification was healthy. James suggested that fraud wasn't. She smiled. "That's when I decided dessert was a bad idea." "Did Mr. Horne deny the accusation?" "Not exactly," Lily said. "He minimized it, said it was common practice. I filed that away under excuses that make juries snort." Wolfe shifted his attention to Horne, whose face was set in the grim rictus of a man who knows he's been weighed and found wanting. "You are familiar," Wolfe said, "with the term breach of fiduciary duty." Horne opened his mouth, closed it, then settled for a dignified silence. "Good," Wolfe said. "It will save time later." The room simmered. Corrigan glared at Horne. Horne pretended not to notice. Garver pretended she wasn't, considering how fast she could jump ship if needed. Lily studied her nails. I studied them too, since they were easier on the eyes than the human wreckage sitting in my office. Wolfe, apparently satisfied that everyone was marinating properly, leaned back. "This situation," he said, "is not about a lunch. It is about leverage." He turned his gaze, slow and deliberate, to Corrigan. "Someone wishes to displace you," he said, "to assume control of the Foundation, its assets and its public face." Corrigan nodded, tight-lipped. "That someone," Wolfe said, "had access to your meeting, knowledge of the tension, and the means to exploit it." He let that hang in the air. Heavy and sour. I knew the drill. It was time to start shaking the tree. Wolfe looked at me. "Archie, you will arrange appointments with the remaining members of the board, privately." "Yes, sir." "And you will uncover, discreetly, any recent irregularities in their financial or personal lives." "Charmed," I said. Wolfe closed his eyes again, a sign that he was done with humanity for the hour. "Miss Garver, Mr. Horne, Miss Rowan, Mr. Corrigan, you will all refrain from speaking to anyone outside this house regarding today's conversation. If you do, I will know." He didn't say how, he didn't have to. Wolfe's version of omniscience was almost as reliable as the IRS. One by one they stood and filed out. Garver cool, Corrigan tense, Horne brittle, Lily amused. When the door finally clicked shut, Wolfe opened his eyes. "Archie," he said, "someone tampered with that lunch, and we are going to find out who." "Sure," I said, "but I hope you're not planning to skip dessert." Wolfe's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile, but I wasn't betting my paycheck on it. Outside, a car engine rumbled. I watched from the window as Corrigan's black town car pulled away from the curb. A moment later, a second car slid out of the shadows and followed at a discreet distance. Somebody was already playing for keeps, and we hadn't even served the main course yet, of course. Following your direction, now generate section 4 of the story, ensuring smooth continuity from the previous section. Maintain the same pacing, character development, and mystery build-up without premature reveals. Keep the word count consistent, around 1,200 words, progressing the narrative naturally while leading into the next section. The next section is titled, "When it comes to fieldwork, I'm Wolfe's legs, eyes, and occasionally his brass knuckles, though he'd rather have me use my tongue or my typewriter." So when he gave me the nod, I grabbed my notebook, my license, and my best suspicious smile, and set out into the steaming jungle of Manhattan's uptown money district. First stop, Eleanor Garver. Miss Garver's office was on the 22nd floor of a glass tower that probably cost more per window than my yearly salary. I was buzzed through by a receptionist who looked like she could juggle a hedge fund and a murder cover-up before her second cup of coffee. Garver's office was exactly what you'd expect. Clean, expensive, sterile enough that bacteria would feel unwelcome. She was waiting, standing behind her desk, a brittle smile welded to her face. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I assume you're not here to make a donation." "Depends," I said, taking a seat uninvited. "What's the minimum donation get me? A guided tour of the skeletons in your closet?" She didn't blink. She perched herself on the edge of her desk and crossed her legs. "You're fishing. I'm afraid this pond is shallow." "Maybe. Maybe it's just murky." I flipped open my notebook and went casual. "Tell me about the Foundation's current projects. Anything new in the last 6 months?" She gave a rundown smooth enough to lubricate a carburetor. Community outreach, scholarships, investments in educational tech. All the words were right, but they had the lifeless thud of someone reciting their Miranda rights. And the Sonterra, "Investment?" I asked, sharpening my tone slightly. That got a pause. Not long, but long enough that if I'd been timing her with a stopwatch, I'd have chalked it up as hesitation. "I wasn't directly involved," she said. "That was a decision between Mr. Horn and the investment committee. Under Mr. Corrigan's oversight," she smiled thinly. "Technically, yes, though he's been less hands-on lately." A neat little dagger slipped between the ribs of her supposed loyalty. I made a mental note. Garver wasn't betting on Corrigan long-term. She was positioning herself for survival, no matter who won. I thanked her with a grin sharp enough to make her look away, and then I got out of there before she decided to throw a stapler at my retreating back. Next stop, Everett Horn. I found him in a dark paneled law office 2 blocks east, his suit jacket off and his tie loosened like he'd just finished an uncomfortable deposition. And maybe he had. Horn greeted me with all the enthusiasm of a man asked to donate a kidney to a stranger. "I've said everything I intend to," he snapped as I closed the door behind me. "Great," I said. "Now say it slower and with fewer lies." He looked at me like he was considering whether lunging across the desk would be worth the potential assault charge. I sat down, stretched out, and waited. "The investment was vetted," he said finally. "Sonterra was recommended by external consultants. And when it went belly up," he grimaced, "we minimized losses, we acquired the assets cheaply." "Through a shell company," I said. "3 layers deep." His lips tightened. "Standard practice." "Sure," I said agreeably, "for organized crime." He didn't rise to the bait. "Smart." I leaned forward. "You stood to gain personally if Corrigan resigned, didn't you?" "No," he said. "Too fast. Too hard." I smiled lazily. "You know what happens to people who lie to Nero Wolfe?" He glared. "They get charged double, only if they survive long enough to pay." I left him stewing and made my 3rd call of the day. Lily Rowan. Tracking Lily down was never hard. She made herself findable when she wanted to be found. I caught up with her sipping a martini at the Algonquin, holding court over a table of minor celebrities and major gossips. She saw me, winked, and dismissed her flock with a queenly wave. "Archie," she said, sliding a glass across the table, "you look like you need this more than I do." I declined the drink but took the seat. "I need more," I said, cutting to the chase. "About the lunch, about the players." She sighed, stirring her drink lazily. "James is earnest, which makes him dangerous. Everett is a climber, which makes him predictable. Eleanor is a survivor, which makes her slippery. And you?" "I'm a spectator," she said lightly, "with expensive seats." Who else knew about the lunch? She frowned slightly. "Well, the lunch reservation was public. James didn't exactly book a private room. Anyone with half a brain and an ounce of motivation could have found out. I thought about that, then asked, "Did you notice anyone unusual, watching?" She tapped her glass. "There was a man at the bar, mid-40s, grey suit, reading a newspaper, like he expected it to bite him. He wasn't drinking, that's unusual in itself." I made another note. Grey suit, newspaper, not drinking, watching, a pro, maybe. Or an amateur who thought he was invisible. Either way, it wasn't nothing. I thanked Lily, promised her a dance I had no intention of delivering, and moved on. Finally, I paid a courtesy call to Saul Panzer, who'd been running down the back channels. While I played foot soldier, Saul's report was slim but solid. Corrigan's financials are clean, he said. No surprise debts, no secret mistresses, no offshore accounts. But the Foundation's investments, somebody's been rearranging deck. Chairs fast, Everett? Most likely, but not alone. Someone else signed off on at least 2 questionable deals. Garver, or someone using her name. We stood there in the dusk, the city buzzing around us like a hive on overtime. "You think it's about money?" I asked. Saul shrugged. "It's always about money, or fear, or revenge. Sometimes all 3. He slipped away into the crowd, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. I headed back to the brownstone. The city had started to cool off, but my gut wasn't fooled. Things were heating up fast. Inside, Wolfe was waiting. He was in his chair, hands steepled, eyes closed, breathing slow. He opened one eye as I entered. "Well?" I handed over my notes. He skimmed them, grunting occasionally. When he finished, he tapped the edge of the page against his palm thoughtfully. "Someone," he said, "is playing a long game." "Sure," I said, "but the pieces are starting to move faster." He nodded once. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin the counter-move." He closed his eyes again. Dismissed. I headed upstairs to type up my notes. Outside, a car cruised slowly past the brownstone, watching, waiting. I made another note to check the locks. This case wasn't just about a ruined lunch anymore. It was about who would still have a chair when the music stopped, and who wouldn't. The brownstone is a lot of things. Fortress, temple, greenhouse, nerve center. But above all, it's Wolfe's, his one true dominion. So when something inside it goes missing, or worse, gets messed with, it's like setting a fire in a cathedral. It was Friday morning when the first tremor hit. I was in the front room, typing up the latest notes for Wolfe's files, when I heard Fritz's panicked voice float in from the kitchen. "Mr. Goodwin, Mr. Wolfe, please." Now Fritz isn't the jumpy type, not unless something really nasty drops into the soup pot. I was up and through the dining room before Wolfe could even grunt an inquiry from his chair. Fritz stood at the kitchen counter, pale as paper. In front of him was a row of Wolfe's prized spice jars, the ones he kept under lock and key like they were radioactive. And one jar, the smallest, the one labelled Ajwain, was missing. I knew enough not to dismiss it. Wolfe's kitchen was sacred. The jars were part of an obsessive system, catalogued to within an inch of their glassy little lives. Nothing ever went missing, not without somebody dying over it. "You're sure you didn't move it?" I asked. Fritz gave me a look that could have curdled milk. "I would never." I nodded, backing off. Okay, when's the last time you saw it?" "Last night, when I prepared the marinade for today's roast." "And who's been in here since?" He thought. "Only myself. And Mr. Wolfe briefly." "And the guests yesterday," I added, tapping the counter. "Corrigan, Horn, Garver, Lily." Fritz wrung his hands. "But they didn't enter the kitchen." "Maybe not," I said. "Maybe." I went back to the office where Wolfe was seated in his chair, eyes shut, fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. When I told him, his fingers froze mid-tap. "Ajwain," he said, almost conversationally. The jar was 3/4 full. "Last I checked, A gift from Pradeep Rao, hand-ground, irreplaceable. I winced. Yeah. He opened his eyes. They weren't furious. Wolfe didn't rage, but they were sharp, cold, calculating. Somebody hadn't just stolen a jar of Indian spice. They'd sent a message. Wolfe turned his gaze to me. Archie. Yes, sir. You will determine how and when this occurred. Discreetly. Naturally. And you will confirm, he added, voice going lower, whether it was an act of opportunity or of intention, which was Wolfe speak for. Figure out if someone slipped past you or if they're setting us up. I spent the next hour retracing every step. The guests had stayed in the front room. Corrigan and Horn hadn't moved much. Horn had hovered close to the fireplace, fuming. Corrigan had paced but never strayed. Lily had floated from chair to chair but hadn't ventured further. Elena Garver had sat quietly, but she had placed her handbag down on the dining room credenza when she first arrived. Right by the swinging door to the kitchen, Fritz hadn't noticed anyone actually entering, but there's a reason pickpockets practice in crowds. Sometimes being around is all you need. I reported back to Wolfe. He listened without moving, absorbing every syllable like a sponge dropped in ink. When I finished, he asked one question. Who benefits? I thought about it. Corrigan didn't. His legacy was on the line. Horn might if the brownstone incident spooked Wolfe into dropping the case. Garver, maybe. She wanted the mess buried, not dragged out. Lily? I trusted Lily as far as you could throw her in heels, which wasn't far, but this wasn't her style. She liked drama, not vandalism. Wolfe nodded slightly, as if reading my mind. This, he said, was not to intimidate me. Then? To test me, he said. To see if I noticed. He steepled his fingers. Which means the true play has not yet been made. I had a bad feeling crawling up my spine, the kind that tells you the safe you're standing next to has been rigged to blow. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. Fritz, still rattled but functional, answered. A young delivery man handed him an envelope. No name, just the address, typed neatly. Fritz brought it in like it was a live grenade. Wolfe gestured and I opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed, withdraw. Before the Foundation's rot soils you too. No signature, no trace. I showed it to Wolfe. He smiled. A thin, humorless line. Ah, he said. The escalation. That afternoon we moved into full lockdown. Fritz double-checked all windows and doors. I made a few calls to Saul Panzer and told him to tail Horn and Garver discreetly but firmly. Wolfe spent the afternoon among his orchids, which is where he goes when the world offends him too much to look at directly. Around 5 o'clock, I was in the office sorting the day's mail when I noticed something else. One of Wolfe's books, a treatise on the origins of culinary spices, had been nudged out of line on the shelf, only half an inch. Maybe nothing. But maybe the kind of nothing that grows teeth and bites you later. I straightened it and checked behind it. Taped to the back, neatly, was another slip of paper. This one just said, "Tonight." Nothing else. No context, no warning, no bluff. I showed it to Wolfe. He did not react outwardly, but he sat very still, which in his case is like most men ducking under artillery fire. "We are being manipulated," he said, voice low, prodded to react, to lose control. "How do you want to play it?" I asked. He smiled, a real one this time, a predator's smile. "We shall bait the trap," he said, and close it. He rang for Fritz, and ordered a full dinner at the usual time, 7:30 sharp, as if nothing had happened, as if we weren't sitting on a powder keg with a lit fuse. At precisely 7:30, Fritz served roast duck with Aiwain-infused glaze. Using a substitute, batch Wolfe had authorized, the missing jar, still missing. Outside, through the half-closed blinds, I caught a glimpse of a figure lingering across the street, watching, waiting. Wolfe, as calm as ever, poured himself a beer and raised it in a small toast. "To patience, Archie," he said. "The deadliest weapon," I lifted my glass of milk. "And to the ones who think they're smarter than us." We drank. The night thickened, and somewhere out there, the real enemy was getting ready to move. We were ready too. At least, I hoped so, because the next move would be theirs, and it would not be subtle. You can spot a real criminal by the way they approach risk. Careful, methodical, watching the angles. You can spot an amateur by the way they kick the hornet's nest, and then stand there wondering why they're getting stung. Friday night, whoever was playing us crossed the line from clever to stupid. The brownstone was locked down tighter than a banker's wallet. Fritz had double-bolted every door. Saul Panzer was doing a lazy lap around the block every half hour. Me? I was posted at the office window nursing a cup of coffee and an itch between my shoulder blades that wouldn't go away. Around 11, the street outside went still. No footsteps, no traffic, no sound, but the city breathing through its teeth. That's when it happened. A soft scritch from the back of the house, just a whisper of metal on metal, like a lock being teased open by someone who thought they were a lot smarter than they were. I slid out of my chair fast but quiet and grabbed the sap I kept tucked in the office drawer for just these occasions. Made it to the back hallway just as the kitchen door creaked inward half an inch. I could have gone for drama. Leaped out, pinned the guy against the icebox, but Wolfe hates violence the way some men hate taxes, personally. So I stayed put, letting the door open fully. The man who slipped in was medium height, wiry, wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled low. He moved like he thought he was invisible. He wasn't. I waited until he was fully inside, then stepped forward and pressed the sap against the back of his neck. "Congratulations," I said. "You just broke into the worst house in New York." He froze. "Hands. Where I can see 'em," I said, friendly but firm. He complied, slowly raising his hands. Fritz appeared behind me a moment later, brandishing a rolling pin with a grim determination that would have made a Viking proud. "Call Saul," I told him. "Tell him we've got company." Fritz nodded and disappeared. Meanwhile, I patted the guy down. No weapons, no tools except a slim Jim and a pair of latex gloves stuffed in his jacket pocket. "Amateur hour. Turn around," I ordered. He did. Late 30s, early 40s, sharp features, nervous eyes. I didn't recognize him, but that didn't mean much. Plenty of hired hands in this town. "You want to explain yourself before the police arrive?" I asked pleasantly. He swallowed. "It's just business, that's all." "Whose business?" He clamped his mouth shut. "Suit yourself," I said. "Wolfe likes a nice long interrogation before bedtime." By the time Saul arrived 10 minutes later, the intruder was sitting in the office, hands cuffed behind his back with a spare set Saul kept in his car. Wolfe watched the scene with a heavy-lidded disdain that could have peeled wallpaper. "Archie," he said, "enough theatrics, we require information." I nodded. I'm not subtle like Wolfe is, but I get results. I leaned against the edge of my desk and crossed my arms. "Here's the deal," I said to the intruder. "You talk. Maybe you walk out of here with your teeth intact. You stay quiet, and Mr. Wolfe, here calls in a few favors that make your life very uncomfortable, very fast." He shifted in his chair, miserable. "I wasn't supposed to get caught," he muttered. "Nobody ever is," I said. "Name." He hesitated. Saul, standing behind him, casually cracked his knuckles. "Tom Rankin," he said finally. "And who sent you, Tom?" He shook his head. "No names." "Okay," I said. "Describe your boss to the nice detective. When they haul you in." Wolfe stirred. "Archie," he said, "let us not pretend we are in a hurry. Let him stew." Meaning, back off, make him sweat. So we did. We left Tom Rankin alone in the office, cuffed to the chair, while Wolfe and I retreated to the front room. "How you think he's tied to Corrigan's problem?" I asked. "I am certain," Wolfe said. "This was a desperate move, clumsy, indicative of someone fearing exposure." "Everett Horne? Possibly, or someone adjacent to him." I mulled that over. Meanwhile, Saul slipped back into the room and sat silently, keeping an eye on Rankin. We waited. At 12:30, Tom Rankin broke. "I was paid," he said when I returned. His voice was raw. "Cash. Envelope left at a drop spot. Instructions typed. No names." "Specifics," Wolfe said, not even looking at him. "The instructions said, enter the brownstone, search the kitchen and the office, find the recording." "The recording," Wolfe repeated. "So it was about the lunch conversation. Someone thought Corrigan or Wolfe had a copy stashed somewhere, which meant they were afraid the original blackmailer had made copies and that Wolfe might have gotten hold of one. Amateurs. Wolfe would never keep something that valuable unsecured, and certainly not in the spice rack." "Anything else?" I asked. "Yeah," Rankin said bitterly. "They told me if I didn't find it, not to come back." "Lovely." Saul called a friendly contact on the force to come scoop Rankin up quietly. No reports, no fingerprints. Wolfe didn't want this getting out yet. By 2 a.m. the brownstone was locked again, double-locked, triple-locked. Wolfe, seated at his desk, tapped his fingers together. "We have flushed our adversary," he said. "They will act swiftly now, they must." "Yeah," I said, sinking into the red chair. "Desperate people make mistakes." "Indeed," Wolfe said, "and desperation has one inevitable end." "Failure," I guessed. He allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "Exposure." I yawned. It had been a long night and we hadn't even had the satisfaction of a clean victory yet. "You want me on guard duty the rest of the night?" He shook his head. "No need, they have played their hand. We need only await the consequences. Easier said than done when you've got a target pinned between your shoulder blades and no idea when the next shot's coming. But Wolfe was never wrong about that kind of thing, which didn't make me sleep any easier. The city outside kept breathing in its slow, dangerous rhythm. Morning would come, and with it, the real fireworks. Saturday morning at the brownstone usually smells like hot. Muffins, coffee, and the faint undercurrent of Fritz's war on cholesterol. This Saturday smelled like tension. I came downstairs at 8 sharp, already half-dressed for trouble. Wolfe was in the office, not among his orchids. That alone was cause for alarm. He hated being off schedule more than he hated most people. He was seated behind his desk, an untouched cup of coffee at his elbow, staring at the far wall like it owed him money. "Something break loose?" I asked, crossing to the red chair. "In a fashion," he said. "Saul Panzer has been industrious. That was Wolfe speak for pay attention, Archie." I sat. Wolfe reached out and with 2 fingers nudged a manila folder toward me like it was something faintly unclean. Inside, a report, Saul's handwriting neat and spare. Summary. Everett Horne had been making quiet moves to line up a block of the Corrigan Foundation board, offering cushy side deals, future investment, partnerships, you name it. Eleanor Garver was involved too, courted heavily, promised advancement if she played ball. And then there was a cherry on top, a payment trail. Thin, but enough. A consulting contract, fictitious, for a shell company linked to Garver. Paid from an account connected to a private venture Horne had recently backed. In short, motive, method, opportunity, gift-wrapped. Wolfe leaned back, his hands steepled. "Our adversaries," he said, "are attempting to ensure their ascension before Mr. Corrigan can stabilize his position. And the blackmail?" He frowned. "Likely an independent gambit, exploited by Horne and Garver once opportunity presented itself." I whistled low. "So either they're working with the blackmailer or piggybacking on him." "Precisely." "And Rankin? The break-in?" "A misguided attempt to retrieve or suppress the evidence. And now, Wolfe allowed himself a brief, satisfied breath. Now, Archie, we invite our guests back to the scene of their folly. The stage was set. At 10:30, sharp, I began making calls. First to Corrigan, telling him Wolfe had urgent developments regarding the Foundation situation. No, I wouldn't explain over the phone. Yes, he needed to come immediately. Then to Horn, polite but firm. Mr. Wolfe strongly advised his presence for clarification purposes. The kind of wording that puts a nail through the veneer of deniability. Elena Garver was next. I kept it brisk. She agreed, too quickly. Last, Lily Rowan, who laughed down the line and said, "Archie dear, if you're throwing another circus, you'd better have better snacks." By noon they were all scheduled to arrive at 3 o'clock. Perfect. Meanwhile, Wolfe spent the intervening hours doing what he does best, sitting, thinking, pruning the mental hedges. I spent it double-checking the locks, setting out chairs, and making sure the recorder was in working order, just in case Wolfe wanted to keep a record of the bloodbath. At 2:45, Fritz set out the coffee and the cold drinks. Wolfe had insisted. He wanted the atmosphere calm, controlled, civilized, because nothing unnerves guilty people faster than pretending you're about to serve them tea while sharpening the knives. The first to arrive was James Corrigan. He was high-heeled, sweaty around the temples, but trying hard to maintain that polished old-money chill. Then Elena Garver, smooth as always, her smile just a little too quick, her handshake just a little too firm. Everett Horn slunk in after her, looking like a man about to propose to the gallows, and finally Lily Rowan trailing perfume and wry amusement. They assembled in the office, settling into the designated chairs like chess pieces moving into inevitable positions. Wolfe waited until Fritz had closed the door behind him, then spoke. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Please be seated." They were already seated, but when Wolfe said that, it felt like an order to stay seated, forever if necessary. "I have," Wolfe continued, "considered the facts surrounding the lunch at the Cressida, the subsequent blackmail attempt, and the more recent trespass upon my property." He allowed that to sink in, dropping the words like small stones into deep water. "There is no need for pretense," he said. "The identity of the blackmailer is immaterial at this juncture. What matters is that someone among you, or some combination thereof, sought to capitalize upon that incident for personal gain." Corrigan opened his mouth, probably to protest his innocence. Wolfe lifted a finger. Corrigan closed his mouth. Wolfe's voice dropped a shade lower. Not louder, just heavier. "Mr. Horn," he said, "your pattern of financial maneuvering is now well-documented. Your efforts to consolidate control over the Foundation, including—" He glanced at a sheet of paper I had discreetly placed on his desk. "The offering of incentives to board members in exchange for their votes." Horn flushed deep red, but stayed silent. "And Miss Garver," Wolfe continued, shifting his gaze, "your complicity is perhaps more subtle. However, the payments to your consulting company," he lifted a brow, "are both recent and illuminating." Garver's smile wavered. Just for a second, but I caught it. "And you, Mr. Corrigan," Wolfe said, turning last to the client himself, "have been played for a fool, though not entirely without your own negligence." Corrigan stiffened. "You allowed too much trust," Wolfe said simply, "and too little scrutiny." He paused. The room felt like it had been shrink-wrapped. "You have been manipulated," Wolfe said, "not by the blackmailer, but by those closest to you, seeking to leverage your vulnerability for their own advancement." He folded his hands on the desk. "Fortunately," he said almost casually, "we now control the outcome." Garver shifted uncomfortably. Horn opened his mouth again, shut it, then opened it again. "This is slander," he said hoarsely. "It is fact," Wolfe corrected. "And in due course the authorities will have ample opportunity to verify it. I slid a second folder onto the table, copies of Saul's findings meticulously organized, enough to bury Horn and Garver if Wolfe chose to tip his hand to the right people, which I figured he would. But only after wringing every last drop. To have advantage out of it, Wolfe let the silence grow. Finally Horn cracked. "What do you want?" he asked. Wolfe smiled slightly. "I want," he said, "what Mr. Corrigan requires: restoration of stability, public exoneration, and internal house-cleaning." He let that hang there, and Wolfe added, "I will accept nothing less, no negotiation, no bargaining, no second chances." The noose had tightened, the trap had closed. The only question now was whether they would submit or struggle, and struggling would only make the rope cut deeper. There's a moment just before Nero Wolfe springs the final trap when even the guilty don't realize how deep they're caught. We were there now. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, that famous quarter-ton of brain and belly perfectly still, while the air in the office grew thicker than the sauce Fritz served on his roast duck. Across from him sat Corrigan, stiff and pale. Next to him Elena Garver, her carefully groomed calm starting to fray around the edges. Then Everett Horn perspiring into the collar of his $1,000 suit. And finally Lily Rowan, the only one in the room who looked like she was enjoying herself. I stood at the wall behind Wolfe's desk, notebook in hand, eyes sharp, waiting for the first crack. Wolfe steepled his fingers and spoke, low and deliberate. "Let. Does be plain." He turned his gaze to Horn, heavy and merciless. "I, sir, intended to assume de facto control of the Corrigan Foundation by orchestrating James Corrigan's resignation under the guise of scandal." Horn's mouth worked like he was trying to chew a rock. "You exploited," Wolfe continued, surreptitiously recorded conversation. Not your own doing, perhaps, but a convenient lever. You colluded with certain board members, promising financial inducements. You created shell entities to mask transactions. Wolfe shifted slightly now, aiming that slow-moving cannon at Garver. "And you, Miss Garver, aligned yourself with Mr. Horn for reasons of ambition and self-preservation. You allowed your name to be attached to illicit payments. You positioned yourself to ascend when the dust settled." Garver's hands folded, neatly in her lap, clenched tighter. Wolfe's voice sharpened, not loud but slicing. "You both engaged in sabotage of trust and duty, and when you feared that the exposure of your scheme might occur, when you believed Mr. Corrigan had retained evidence, you conspired to retrieve it by unlawful entry into my home." Horn's face went from red to gray. Garver's eyes darted, toward the door then back again, trapped. Corrigan sat forward suddenly. "Wait," he said hoarsely. "If they weren't the ones who recorded the lunch, who did?" Wolfe's lips twitched. He allowed himself a sliver of satisfaction before answering. "An independent party," Wolfe said. "Most likely a disgruntled employee or a freelance operative seeking blackmail profit. Their existence was inconvenient to Mr. Horn and Miss Garver, but opportune." He folded his hands neatly. "In other words," he said, "they did not orchestrate the blackmail, but they eagerly weaponized it." Garver's mask cracked first. "You don't understand," she said sharply, her voice cracking like ice underfoot. "I didn't mean—" "You meant," Wolfe said mildly, "to advance yourself by betrayal." She bit her lip, eyes flashing, but didn't. "Deny it," Horn bristled. "You have no proof," he said thickly. "This is all conjecture." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "we have documentation of your shell companies, testimony from your bribed board members, and corroborative accounts from your financial intermediaries, secured, I might add, through discreet inquiry." I tapped my notebook for effect, and Wolfe added, "We have the attempted burglary, a misstep of astonishing stupidity." Horn stood up suddenly, fists clenched. "This is entrapment," he barked. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "You are free to leave," he said. The authorities will simply receive the evidence without the benefit of your explanations. Garver grabbed Horn's sleeve, whispering frantically. He shook her off. Corrigan, who had been silent, stood now as well. "If you resign," he said coldly, "both of you, immediately, there might still be a path to private settlement." "You can't," Horn began, but Corrigan cut him off with surprising steel. "I can, and I will." The two conspirators looked at each other. It wasn't a gaze of shared loyalty. It was the grim understanding of two rats spotting the rising tide. Finally, Horn slumped. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll resign." Wolfe's mouth twitched again. "I thought you might." He nodded to me. I retrieved 2 prepared letters of resignation Wolfe had drafted earlier, courtesy of Saul's intelligence gathering. All they needed were signatures. Silently, grimly, Horn and Garver signed. Corrigan took the papers, folded them precisely, and tucked them into his breast pocket. "Now," Wolfe said, "there remains one final task." He turned his gaze surprisingly to Corrigan. "You must ensure that the Foundation's internal processes are reformed to prevent recurrence of such abuses. Otherwise, these events will repeat, only more cleverly." Corrigan nodded, looking chastened but determined. "I will," he said. "Good," Wolfe said. There was a rustle as Garver and Horn rose stiffly. "You may leave," Wolfe said. They didn't wait for a second invitation. They slipped out, like a pair of ghosts fleeing daylight. When the front door closed behind them, the silence inside the brownstone was profound. Corrigan turned to Wolfe. "I don't know how to thank you." "You may do so," Wolfe said, "by keeping your foundation worthy of your grandfather's legacy." Corrigan nodded, shook my hand firmly, and left. Only Lily remained, sitting back in her chair with a cat-like expression of satisfaction. "Well," she said, "that was bracing." "Phooey," Wolfe muttered, rising heavily from his chair. "Contemptible." "But neatly done," she said, standing. I escorted her to the door, lingering just long enough for her to lean close. "You're still owed that dance, Archie," she whispered, and then she was gone. I returned to the office. Wolfe had already seated himself again, a beer in hand. Outside, the afternoon sunlight slanted through the blinds. The brownstone was quiet once, more just the way Wolfe liked it. I leaned back in my chair and said, "So was it the missing spice jar that gave it away?" He sipped his beer and looked thoughtful. "No," he said, "it was the desperation. Always the desperation." He closed his eyes. Dinner would be in an hour. Fritz was probably already basting something complicated. The world, at least within these walls, was back in order. After a dust-up like that, most men would want a drink, a nap, or a couple of aspirin the size of hubcaps. Wolfe? Wolfe wanted clarity. The brownstone was still. The faint clatter of Fritz in the kitchen, the only soundtrack as the evening settled in. I had refilled Wolfe's beer without being asked, a sure sign that we were approaching the final act, and now sat in my chair, notebook resting on my knee, waiting. Wolfe sipped slowly, eyes half-lidded, considering. When he spoke, it was in that deliberate tone that told me he was past speculation and deep into the kingdom of certainty. "Archie," he said, "review the sequence." I knew better than to argue. I flipped open my notebook. "James Corrigan came to us," I said, "claiming blackmail after a lunch meeting where Everett Horn made some questionable financial remarks. He received a recording of the conversation and a demand for resignation." I flipped a page. "Following that," I continued, "Eleanor Garver showed up, claiming to have been warned anonymously about scandal brewing. She positioned herself as loyal, but was clearly angling for survival depending on who came out on top." Wolfe nodded faintly. I pressed on. "You noted early that the blackmail itself wasn't necessarily central to the real threat. It was a lever, an excuse for Horn and Garver to consolidate power." Wolfe grunted, a sound that meant yes and continue. The tampering in the brownstone, the missing age-wane spice, wasn't vandalism. It was a test, to see if you were alert enough to notice a small violation. And, Wolfe murmured. And you were, I said, which made it clear someone inside the circle had both opportunity and nerve. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, savoring the accuracy like a fine bite of food. I pushed onward, warming up. The break-in that followed, the attempt to steal supposed evidence, was desperation. It told you that Horn and Garver believed there was more at stake than a bad lunch recording. They feared exposure of a broader conspiracy, bribery, financial, a misconduct, betrayal of the Foundation's mission. Wolfe opened his eyes, sharp now. Precisely. He shifted slightly, the great weight of his mind clicking into full gear. From the beginning, he said, the salient fact was not that someone recorded the lunch, it was that someone used it. He lifted a finger. Opportunity, timing, access, those were the keys. Garver and Horn, I said, already working together, already maneuvering. Yes, they seized upon the existence of the blackmail threat, not by creating it but by weaponizing it for their own purposes. And the actual blackmailer, Wolfe shrugged faintly. An opportunist, a scavenger, unimportant. Once the real rot was identified, I leaned forward a little. What about Lily's observation, the man at the bar? Wolfe's mouth twitched. Ah, yes, a useful clue. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a slim folder. Saul identified him this morning. A minor private investigator, licensed but disreputable. Likely hired by the original blackmailer to monitor Horn and Corrigan. To see if they took the bait? Indeed. Wolfe set the folder aside as if dismissing the entire side issue. The essential point, he said, was ambition. Horn sought power. Garver sought stability. Both needed Corrigan out. The blackmail merely accelerated their timeline. And they thought you had the recording, I said. They feared it, Wolfe corrected. And fear makes men foolish. He shifted, reaching for his beer. They broke into my house, he said, voice low and weighty. They desecrated the sanctity of the brownstone, a rare edge of real anger under the cool surface. You were never going to let that slide, I said. No, Wolfe said simply. He finished his beer with a finality that matched his words. And now? I asked. Wolfe wiped his mouth delicately with a napkin. Now, Mr. Corrigan will stabilize the Foundation. The blackmail exposed to sunlight will shrivel. The true conspirators have been neutralized. And the original blackmailer? Wolfe shrugged. The authorities will find them or not. It is irrelevant. He stood, slowly, heavily, stretching. I have achieved my objective, which, translated from Wolfese, meant order has been restored. My personal universe has been corrected, and everyone else can go hang. He moved toward the dining room. I trailed after him. At the table, Fritz had set out a masterpiece, braised squab with winter greens, a chilled Riesling, and a chocolate tart that smelled like heaven's pantry. We sat. As Fritz served, Wolfe spoke again, almost conversationally. Archie. Yes. Sir? You understand I trust the true morale of this affair? I thought about it. Trust the wrong people, I said. And you lose everything? Close, Wolfe said. He took a bite of the squab, chewed, swallowed, and dabbed at his lips. The true. A lesson, he said, is simpler. Power without loyalty is a blade without a hilt. It cuts first its wielder. He said it as if quoting scripture. I nodded, making a mental note to remember the phrasing. Wolfe's pearls of wisdom were rare enough to deserve gold frames. He gestured toward my plate. Eat, he said. Yes, sir. I dug in. The squab was tender enough to fall apart on the fork, the greens tart and crisp, the wine sharp and clear. For a while we ate in silence, the weight of the past days lifting, meal by meal. Outside, the city continued to churn and sputter and seethe. Inside, the brownstone was still unbroken, whole just the way Wolfe liked it, and just the way it would stay, at least until the next fool decided to test the fortress. By Sunday morning, the brownstone had returned to what passes for peace in our little corner of the universe, which is to say it was almost unnervingly quiet. Fritz, having survived the culinary onslaught of the past week, was polishing the silver in the kitchen with the smugness of a man who had chosen to fight chaos with elbow grease. Saul Panzer had called early to confirm that Everett Horn and Elena Garver had each, separately and silently, tendered their resignations to the Corrigan Foundation's board. No fireworks, no lawsuits, no headlines, just the dull, satisfactory thud of ambitions collapsing into dust. I sat at my desk in Wolfe's office, updating the case files, trying not to yawn. Wolfe himself was in the plant rooms upstairs, communing with his orchids, an activity that restores him to himself in a way no amount of beer or beef can quite manage. The city outside rumbled on as usual, cars honking, pigeons plotting, humanity grinding through its endless ambitions. Inside, the brownstone hummed along to its own slower, deeper rhythm. At noon, Wolfe reappeared, wearing the sort of expression he reserves for special occasions, like when Fritz gets an especially rare white truffle, or when the New York Gazette. "Prince, a correction," he demanded. He seated himself behind his desk, arranged his bulk with ritualistic care, and regarded me. "Report, Archie." "All's well," I said. Saul's confirmation came in. "Corrigan is back in charge. The board's rattled but solidifying, no new blackmail threats, no signs that the original tape made it beyond the first extortion attempt." Wolfe nodded once, heavy and slow. "And the intruder?" "Rankin's out of circulation," I said. "The cops picked him up last night on unrelated outstanding warrants. He's got enough legal problems to keep him busy for years." "Good." He closed his eyes, briefly savoring the stability, like a man savoring a well-aged cheese, you might say, I added. "The house has been fumigated." He opened one eye. "That metaphor," he said, "is appalling," I grinned. "But accurate." He grunted, which in Wolf-speak means I concede the point, but refuse to encourage you. There was a long silence. The good kind. The kind that means nothing. Needs urgent fixing, bribing, or burying. Finally, Wolfe spoke again. "This case," he said, "was a particular offense." "Because they trespassed?" "Because," Wolfe said. "They presumed they could manipulate a structure built on loyalty and integrity with mere opportunism." He opened both eyes now, studying me with that heavy-lidded intensity that meant he was thinking aloud, not just lecturing. The Corrigan Foundation, despite its vulnerabilities, was founded on an idea, a legacy. Those who sought to hollow it out from within believed they could replace meaning with maneuver. He shook his head. "It is a fallacy," he said. "Meaning cannot be manufactured, only defended." I leaned back, thinking about it. "I guess," I said, "that's what makes a real legacy stick. The people willing to bleed a little to protect it." "Phooey," Wolfe muttered. "Sentimentality." But he didn't really mean it. He picked up the Gazette, ignoring me for the moment, and thumbed through the front page. No mention of the Corrigan Foundation scandal. No hint that Manhattan's gilded philanthropic circles had almost eaten one of their own alive. That was the final proof Wolfe had played the game exactly right. Silence, public quiet, private correction. He preferred it that way. I sat for a while, watching the afternoon light stretch across the floorboards, feeling the kind of satisfaction you don't get often enough in this line of work. A job not just done, but done properly. At around 2 o'clock the phone rang. Fritz answered in the hall. He came into the office a moment later, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Rowan, sir," he said, "wishes to speak with Mr. Goodwin." I took the receiver. "Archie." "Here?" "Archie, dear," Lily said, her voice like warm silk. "I hope you're free this evening." "Depends," I said. "Is there food involved?" "Naturally. And perhaps," she added lightly, "a dance." I laughed. Now you're just stacking the deck. 7 o'clock then. Done. I hung up, feeling a little lighter. Wolfe, predictably, hadn't even looked up from his paper. You will, of course, observe proper precautions, he said without lifting his gaze. I always do, I said, heading for the stairs to clean up. You rarely do, he corrected. He wasn't wrong, but that was half the fun. As I climbed, I thought about what Wolfe had said, about legacy, about loyalty, about meaning. It wasn't just the Corrigan Foundation that had survived a quiet little war for its soul. It was the brownstone itself. Every case, every fight, every scheme that fell apart against Wolfe's immovable resistance, it was all part of the same thing. A structure, an idea, a fortress. You couldn't fake that, you could only defend it. Downstairs, Wolfe turned a page in the paper, grunted at the news, and reached for his beer. Dinner would be at 7. Fritz was already preparing lamb shanks and scalloped potatoes. Outside, Manhattan hustled and schemed and stumbled over itself, chasing money, fame, and bigger mistakes. Inside, the brownstone stood still and steady, its walls thick with silence and defiance. Tomorrow would bring new clients, new problems, new trespassers. But tonight order was restored, and if anyone wanted to test it again, well, they knew where to find us. It said that in this line of work, you only get so many quiet moments. And if you let your guard down, even for a second, that's when trouble will find you. It's the kind of wisdom that sounds ridiculous, considering how often we make a living from the messes others make. But there's something to it, too. The quiet is earned, and never by accident. It was early Sunday evening. The last remnants of daylight trickled in through the blinds, casting long shadows across the brownstone's old hardwood floors. Fritz was, as usual, at the stove, humming to himself while preparing dinner. The scent of roast lamb and garlic reached the office, mingling with the faint traces of cigarette smoke lingering from earlier in the day. I leaned back in my chair, my feet comfortably up on the desk, as I studied the case file one last time. Everything had been wrapped up neatly, too neatly if I'm being honest. A couple of well-placed calls, a few favors called in, and our guests, Horn and Garver, had fallen quietly into the trap Wolfe had set. Corrigan was back in charge of the foundation, and the scandal was contained. No one was the wiser about the games that had been played, and the truth was buried beneath a nice, clean rug. Wolfe, of course, was completely unconcerned with the aftermath. He was already on to his next thing, his orchids, as always, taking priority over any human drama. The case had been resolved, justice had been done, but in Wolfe's world, the order of things is paramount, and he'd restored it with his characteristic precision. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. "Enter," I called out. Fritz appeared, holding a tray with 2 steaming plates of lamb shank and mashed potatoes, his face showing a hint of amusement. "Dinner, Mr. Goodwin." I smiled at him, sitting up from my relaxed posture. "I see you've outdone yourself again, Fritz." Wolfe, of course, didn't look up from his book, but his grunted acknowledgement was all that was needed. Fritz served the plates, one for me, one for Wolfe, and then slipped out without a word. As I dug into the rich, savory meal, I couldn't help but reflect on the case. There was something satisfying about the way Wolfe handled things. Always. Deliberate, always calm, always in control. His patience was a weapon, one he wielded with the precision of a surgeon. I glanced over at him. Wolfe had taken a bite of his own meal, but he was already lost in thought. The kind of thought that no one could penetrate unless he chose to share it. I wiped my mouth with the napkin, setting it down carefully. "You know," I said, breaking the silence, "it almost seemed too easy. Horn and Garver, I expected a bit more of a fight." Wolfe took a sip of his beer, his gaze fixed on the orchid in the corner of the room. "I don't need to fight with fools, Archie. I simply wait for them to make their move." "Is that what they were, fools?" I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his lack of concern. "A man who believes he can deceive another through ambition alone is a fool," Wolfe said. his voice taking on that familiar tone of understated disdain. Ambition without integrity is as fragile as glass. It shatters the moment it's tested. To me the glass cracked pretty quickly. I leaned back, considering it. I would have thought they'd try to keep up the charade, at least for a little while longer. They thought they could outmaneuver me, Wolfe replied, his voice never rising above a murmur. But men who are adept at moving pawns often forget that kings don't need to move to win the game. I smiled at that. Wolfe was always one to deliver his observations with that particular brand of detached superiority. It was a gift he possessed, one he used sparingly but to great effect. "So what now?" I asked, pushing my plate aside. "It's over. No more loose ends?" Wolfe finally looked up from his orchids, his eyes briefly meeting mine. There was a spark of something, perhaps satisfaction, or simply the recognition that the pieces had all fallen into place. "The truth is simple, Archie," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "A man's character is revealed by his actions, not his words. And the actions of Garver and Horn were plain to see. The foundation is in capable hands now. The rest is irrelevant." I nodded slowly, understanding exactly what he meant. It wasn't about the crime itself. It never had been. It was about the underlying currents of human nature, the need for power, the thirst for control, and the way those impulses shaped people's choices. "But you were right," I added, considering it for a moment. "Horn and Garver, they both overplayed their hands. They underestimated you." Wolfe's lips twitched just the slightest hint of a smile. "I find," he said, his voice dry as dust, "that most people do." I sat back, letting the weight of his words sink in. Wolfe was always a few steps ahead, even when he wasn't actively playing the game. It was how he lived, how he'd always lived. Detached, yes, immovable, certainly. But the mind behind the fortress was as sharp as ever. "And what about the blackmail?" I asked. "The tape and all that?" "It was incidental," Wolfe said, his gaze returning to the orchid. "The blackmailer was nothing more than a catalyst. Garver and Horn had their own agenda. The tape was a means to an end, but in the end it was the choices they made that sealed their fate." I nodded, understanding. Wolfe's mind had always worked in ways that made sense only after the fact. He wasn't concerned with surface-level drama. He was interested in the deeper game, the one that played out beneath the facade. The silence in the room stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply the quiet of someone who had done their job well, and now the work was done. "You did it again, Wolfe," I said finally, breaking the stillness. "Another one bites the dust." "Indeed," he replied, taking another sip of his beer. "And the dust, as always, remains where it belongs, beneath the weight of proper reasoning." I smiled. "I'll drink to that." I leaned back, enjoying the meal, the quiet, and the satisfaction of a case solved without fuss, without blood, and without unnecessary drama. The brownstone, after all, was a sanctuary, and as long as Wolfe was at the helm, it always would be. Outside, the world continued to turn. Inside, order had been restored, as it always was, and just like that, the case of the Corrigan Foundation, like so many before it, was wrapped up and put to rest. Wolfe had won again, as he always did, and for me, that was enough.